Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we are tackling one of the most famously misunderstood historical figures of all time. Let's just dive right into it. Today, our explainer is completely focused on demystifying Karl Marx, specifically his true, highly complex thoughts on religion. We're going to map out exactly how his theories actually evolved.
Now, if you know even a little bit about Karl Marx, I can almost guarantee you've heard this exact phrase. Religion is the opium of the people. This quote is so famous, right? But it's so often used as the ultimate tip of the iceberg to just equate Marxism simply with atheism. People use it to suggest he believed folks just use religion to artificially medicate themselves.
But hold on a second. What did Marx actually mean when he wrote those words? It is a question we really need to ask. Because while that line definitely suggests an artificial medication on the surface, it hides a much deeper, much more nuanced philosophical story. To solve this historical mystery, we're taking a structured journey through 19th century German philosophy. Here is the game plan. 1. Beyond the opium quote. 2. The modern state divided. 3. Overturning Hegel's divine history. 4. Feuerbach and the abstract. 5. Political versus human emancipation. And finally, 6. The true meaning of opium. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Beyond the Opium Quote. We need to set up the academic foundation for everything we're exploring today.
We are grounding our entire explainer today in this really fascinating piece of source material. It's a master's thesis by Jate Steedman from Claremont Graduate University. What's so interesting about this academic work is how it explores that Marx's ideas on religion and social change might not actually be diametrically opposed, like so many people just assume. In fact, they might actually perfectly complement each other.
Moving into Section 2, The Modern State Divided. Because to understand how Marx got there, we first have to look at his geopolitical context.
Think about this stark contrast here. Back in the 19th century, Germany was pretty much lagging behind the rest of Europe in political development, but it was setting the absolute global pace when it came to philosophical thought. Marx argued that the modern state had created this brand new, really antithetical division in society. On one hand, you have civil life. These are our selfish, particular interests as individuals. And on the other, you have political life, the universal interests of the state. Before the modern era, say back in medieval times, these were actually unified. But in the modern democratic state, Marx saw these two spheres as being in fundamental conflict. That brings us to Section 3, Overturning Hegel's Divine History. This is the philosophical battleground, and it's where we meet the first of Marx's major intellectual sparring partners, George Hegel. So, to understand Hegel, we got to tackle his core concept, sublation. Now, for Hegel, God was the absolute epicenter of literally everything. He viewed history essentially as the autobiography of God. Think of God as this developing spirit of the universe, right? And this spirit only becomes fully realized when particular human minds actually conceive of him. For Hegel, history was literally this massive meta-process of moving back and through God. And here is exactly where Marx draws the line. For Hegel, history is entirely top-down. It is driven by divine providence and God's ultimate plan. But for Marx, history is bottom-up. He believed history is driven by the very base, concrete needs of society, just people's everyday desire to live, eat, and flourish. Marx vehemently disagreed with Hegel's top-down view. He argued that relying on God and divine providence was actually just a massive distraction from real, earthly human progress. All right, Section 4, Feuerbach and the abstract. So Marx completely rejects Hegel's divine history. And that leads us to his next intellectual opponent, a philosopher named Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach famously claimed that religion is the dream of the human mind. He introduced this incredibly scandalous concept for the time, theology as anthropology. Feuerbach argued that God actually doesn't exist as an absolute independent subject at all. Instead, he said divine traits are completely bound to human beings. Basically, God only exists because human beings think of him. Feuerbach took the focus from the heavens and yanked it straight down to the earth. Now, Marx actually loved this idea at first, but he eventually realized it had a massive, glaring flaw. And this brings us to a really critical term for Marx, praxis. Praxis means concrete, real-world human activity. Marx's major critique of Feuerbach was that simply changing how we think about religion, just resolving it into a human invention, is totally useless if it stays stuck in the realm of abstract theory. If you aren't changing the concrete social conditions that human beings actually breathe, eat, and work in, well, you haven't actually accomplished a single thing.
That takes us to Section 5, Political versus Human Emancipation. This realization about needing real, concrete change brings us to the final sparring partner in Marx's journey, Bruno Bauer. The crucial point to grasp here is the difference between two totally different types of emancipation. Bruno Bauer argued that religious commitments were the main barrier to creating a true democratic state. He literally thought religion needed to be abolished for us to have political freedom. But Marx strongly disagreed. Marx pointed out that look at places like the United States. You already have political emancipation there. The state has freed itself from religious restriction by separating church and state. And yet people still heavily practice religion. Why is that? Because Marx says they haven't achieved human emancipation. The human being is still alienated and suffering in their actual day-to-day social reality. For Marx, this was the ultimate proof. Religion itself is not the disease. It is merely a symptom of a caustic state. It's like a gauge on a dashboard that proves the real, earthly conditions of a society are still actively failing its people, leaving them totally isolated and socially divided. And finally, Section 6, the true meaning of opium. With all of this 19th century philosophical context under our belts, we can finally head back to the surface of the iceberg to solve the mystery of that famous quote. When Marx called religion the opium of the people, we really have to look at what opium actually was in his time. First off, opium was a completely legitimate, absolutely necessary painkiller. It was used widely by the working class who simply could not afford doctors. Marx even used it himself later in life to deal with physical pain. But secondly, it was also a highly profitable, often heavily diluted and contaminated substance, completely controlled by the wealthy classes. It was sitting right at the very center of class struggle and wealth imbalance. Knowing that historical context, it completely changes how we read Marx's dialectical view of religion. Just listen to this quote. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Just like 19th century opium, religion is a flawed but completely necessary painkiller for folks in deep distress. The squalid, terrible conditions of the working class required a fantastic narrative that promised hope, precisely because they had zero agency to fix your actual lives. So what is the ultimate takeaway here? For Marx, religion is just the container. It's not the disease itself. His true target was actually never religion. His real target was the economic and political conditions that made those illusions necessary in the first place. He wanted to take the forcible momentum of religious protest, redirect it away from what he called an illusory sun, and point it right back down toward fixing earthly, concrete economic inequalities. As he put it, the criticism of heaven must turn into the criticism of earth. And that perfectly encapsulates his demand for praxis, leading us to his most powerful conclusion. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. He demanded real-world, concrete social change instead of just empty, abstract philosophical theory. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative question to chew on. Based on everything we've just uncovered about Marx's true critique, how do structural inequalities continue to shape our modern belief systems today? Is our own need for meaning or for relief still being driven by the concrete economic conditions of our time? It is such a fascinating lens to view our modern world through. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this source material today. I really hope this gave you a totally new perspective on a very misunderstood metaphor.